On May 27, 1831, in what is now southern Kansas, a small group of merchants from New Mexico, then part of the Mexican Republic, gathered near the Arkansas River. They were engaged in trade with the Comanche, exchanging goods and services that held mutual value. The scene was typical of the region, trade accompanied by an air of caution. The merchants, weathered from their travels, had just concluded negotiations. However, trading in the southern plains often carried an underlying risk of conflict. The Comanche were not only formidable warriors, but also astute traders. Their territory, known as Comancheria, spanned parts of present-day Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Kansas, and Colorado, encompassing one of the most powerful indigenous nations in North America at the time. Over the years, a few seasoned traders had managed to establish delicate, mutually advantageous relationships with the Comanche. These connections, forged through diplomacy and respect, were a lifeline for traders navigating the dangers of Comancheria. Unlike newcomers who entered the region seeking wealth and frequently met violent ends or disappeared entirely, this particular group of traders had a distinct advantage. They were descendants of Spanish settlers who had intermarried with indigenous peoples, granting them a deeper understanding of Comanche customs and ways of life. This familiarity enabled them to survive in a volatile region and carve out a precarious but lucrative role as intermediaries between the Spanish-descended settlers of New Mexico and the Comanche. Despite these partnerships, the broader history of interaction between the Comanche and settlers was marked by conflict, driven by competition over resources, cultural misunderstandings, and shifting political landscapes. While moments of cooperation existed, they were underscored by the ever-present tension of a region shaped by survival and resilience. The Comanche had been a dominant force across the plains for over a century, their raids driven by a mix of retribution, survival, and territorial expansion. Their incursions ranged from the Texas Hill Country to the high plains of Colorado, instilling fear in both neighboring tribes and settlers. Despite their fearsome reputation as relentless warriors, the Comanche were also adept traders. Their vast territories were rich with buffalo herds, yielding hides and meat, as well as warhorses essential to their nomadic lifestyle. However, there were goods they could not produce on their own, such as metal tools, highly valued for crafting arrowheads and weapons, vibrant dyes for artistic decoration, and textiles that they lacked the skills to weave. To acquire these items, the Comanche turned to traders like the ones gathered by the Arkansas River. These merchants brought copper, iron, cotton, firearms, and textiles, exchanging them for buffalo hides, horses, and other valuable resources controlled by the Comanche. Over time, these traders learned how to navigate the unwritten rules of the plains, establishing reliable trade routes and earning the trust of their Comanche counterparts. By adhering to these customs and demonstrating respect, they minimized the risk of violence, although the possibility of conflict was ever present. On this particular day in 1831, the traders had successfully concluded their business with the Comanche and were preparing to leave, weary from the journey and eager to return home. But as they loaded their goods and prepared to depart, a distant figure on horseback caught their attention. At first, they assumed it was a Comanche scout. However, as the rider approached, his appearance set him apart. This was no Comanche. The lone rider was an American, and unbeknownst to the traders, he was one of the most legendary figures of the American frontier, Jedediah Strong Smith. By this point in 1831, Smith had already journeyed farther than most could imagine. Born in upstate New York, he had traveled through the Great Lakes region, St. Louis, the Dakotas, the Rocky Mountains, the Mojave Desert, and the West Coast, including California and Oregon, venturing as far north as Canada. His adventures included surviving attacks by the Arikara, Mojave, and Umpqua tribes, as well as a brutal grizzly bear mauling that left him permanently scarred. Despite enduring these harrowing experiences, Smith remained driven by an insatiable sense of adventure. Smith had worked alongside many of the most famous mountain men of his era, including William Ashley, Jim Bridger, and Hugh Glass. Many of his contemporaries met violent ends in their quest for fortune in the untamed wilderness, but Smith had survived. Through it all, His deep faith and belief in free enterprise kept him focused on building a future for his family. After a particularly grueling expedition, Smith returned to St. Louis in 1829, intending to retire. He purchased a house and sent money to his father in Ohio, signaling his intention to settle down. Yet, like so many frontiersmen, Smith could not ignore the call of the wilderness. By 1831, his wanderlust had reignited, and the opportunity to lead an expedition to Santa Fe, a burgeoning center for trade, proved irresistible. Driven by ambition and a restless spirit, Smith ventured once more into the vast and unpredictable frontier, cementing his legacy as one of the most remarkable explorers of his time. And so Jedediah Smith joined forces with William Sublette and David Jackson, leading a wagon train laden with goods destined for the burgeoning trade networks in the Southwest. Initially, the journey seemed straightforward, with the wagon train progressing smoothly. However, as the days wore on, they encountered a dire challenge. Their water supply began to dwindle. By May 27, 1831, they were entirely out of fresh water for both themselves and their livestock, leaving the group in a critical situation. Smith and a companion, Thomas Fitzpatrick, volunteered to scout for water. They headed south, hoping to find a spring or source of drinkable water. Eventually, they reached what they thought would be salvation, a spring near the Samaritan River. To their dismay, the water there was undrinkable, tainted with salt. While Fitzpatrick stayed behind to dig a makeshift well in a small depression, Smith continued further south in search of another source of water. It was during this search that Smith encountered a group of Comancheros, Spanish or Mexican traders who often acted as intermediaries between settlers and the Comanche. The Comancheros were immediately suspicious of Smith. They were acutely aware of the presence of Comanche warriors in the area and feared any association with the American could draw unwanted attention or provoke hostility. Despite their wariness, the Comancheros warned Smith about the nearby Comanche and advised him to leave the area quickly. Smith, however, was undeterred. His party's survival hinged on securing water, and retreating without finding a source was not an option. Reluctantly, the Comancheros pointed him toward a spring a few miles away. As Smith made his way toward it, his movements had already been noticed. A group of 15 to 20 Comanche warriors had been tracking him from a distance. Likely, they had observed him long before he had encountered the Comancheros. To the Comanche, Smith's presence was not just an immediate threat. It was a symbol of the broader encroachment by American settlers on their land. Fiercely protective of their territory, the Comanche were quick to perceive outsiders as trespassers, especially those traveling alone or in small groups. When Smith arrived at the spring, the Comanche warriors surrounded him in a crescent formation, cutting off any escape. Smith attempted to communicate using sign language and the fragments of Spanish he knew, but the Comanche showed no interest in negotiation. The tension mounted as the warriors taunted Smith's horse, attempting to spook it and unseat its rider. Despite the growing danger, Smith remained composed and tried to barter for his life. He offered his possessions, firearms, tools, and other valuable goods, in the hopes of appeasing the warriors. But the Comanche were not there to bargain. For them, this encounter was about protecting their land and asserting their dominance in the face of intruders. Suddenly, the fragile standoff erupted into violence. Without warning, a shot rang out. A Comanche warrior fired, striking Smith in the shoulder. The impact sent him reeling in pain, and his panicked horse bucked beneath him, adding to the chaos. Even as searing pain coursed through his body from the gunshot wound, Jedediah Smith's instincts and resilience took over. With a final burst of energy, he managed to return fire, striking and killing one of the Comanche warriors. However, this act only enraged the others. In an instant, the remaining warriors descended upon him, pulling him from his horse and surrounding him with their lances. The attack was swift and merciless. Smith, fully aware of his impending fate, fought back with all the strength he could muster. But it was futile. The Comanche's superior numbers and weapons quickly overwhelmed him. Their anger and resolve to protect their territory were evident in every strike. Smith's efforts to defend himself were no match for the warriors, who mocked and jeered as they beat and stabbed him. Within moments, Jedediah Smith lay dead, his lifeless body left behind on the vast plains. The Comanche, having avenged their fallen comrade and asserted their dominance, took Smith's horse, rifles, pistols, and other possessions before retreating into the expanse of the prairie. Smith's body was left where he fell, never to be recovered. His tragic death marked the end of one of the most legendary frontiersmen of the American West. Days later, the Sublette Jackson party, traveling along the Santa Fe Trail, encountered the Comancheros, who had traded with the Comanche. The Comancheros, wary but willing to share what they knew, produced Smith's rifles and pistols as evidence of what had transpired. Among the group was Smith's brother, Austin, who immediately recognized the items. The grim reality of Smith's death was now undeniable. Austin Smith, devastated by the loss, later wrote to their father in Ohio to share the heartbreaking news. In his letter, he explained, "Your son Jedediah was killed on the summer of the 27th of May, on his way to Santa Fe, by the Comanche Indians. His party was in distress for water, and he had gone alone in search of the above river, which he found when he was." The letter ended abruptly, leaving behind an enduring testament to the tragedy that befell one of the most remarkable figures of the American frontier. Jedediah Smith's death, though untimely and brutal, symbolized the immense risks and challenges faced by those who sought to chart the uncharted and build a future in the untamed wilderness of North America.